So believe it or not, we've finally come to the last alleged error within Matthew's genealogy. So let's clear the board. And in this video, we're going to be discussing the large time variations between the three groups of 14. So this will be addressing why there's 1,000 years between Abraham and David, but only 400 years between Solomon and Jeconiah, and then 600 years between Shealtiel and Jesus. We'll be specifically dealing with why there's such a large difference between 1,000 and 400. But let's first get our head around this issue by creating a timeline. So Abraham, in round numbers, was born in about 2000, and David was born in about 1000. So this is a 1,000-year gap between Abraham and David. The next event in Matthew's genealogy is the Babylonian captivity, which again in round numbers occurred in about the year 600. So between David and the Babylonian captivity, we're dealing with about 400 years. And finally, from the Babylonian captivity to Christ being born in about the year 0, we're dealing with 600 years. So this presents us with a real issue, because 1,000 is a lot bigger than 400 and 600. And you'd expect each of these time spans to be relatively equivalent. As Matthew tells us, there's about 14 generations between each one. So why is there such large time variations? And we can actually show this even more acutely by dividing each of these ages by 14. And by so doing this, we're going to be showing the age of childbearing of each individual. So if you get 1,000 and you divide it by 14 generations, that means that each person would have had to given birth to a child at about the age of 71. If you do the same thing to the 400 years, you get to about 28 years of age. And if you do the same thing to the 600 years, you get to about 42. So 71, 28, and 42, these are huge differences, especially the 71 years of age. And this video is specifically going to be dealing with this large gap between Abraham and David. And what's very important to note here is that this is not specifically Matthew's fault. This is an error Matthew has inherited from the Old Testament. So this is in many ways like issue number 6, when we discussed who was the father of Zerubbabel. As we noted, the Old Testament is a bit confused as to who Zerubbabel's father is. Is it Shealtiel or is it Pedaiah? Well, that depends if you are consulting 1 Chronicles or Ezra. So Matthew really can't be held responsible for this error, and that's why we put a question mark here, because this is an error of the Old Testament. And likewise, when we come to this issue, and dealing with this 1,000-year gap between Abraham and David, it is not specifically an issue with Matthew, but is more so an issue with the Old Testament. And specifically, it's an issue with the genealogy given in the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, at the very end, we're given a genealogy from Perez, so this is the son of Judah, all the way down to David. Now, what we find out is that there are 10 generations from Perez and David. And when you do a bit of investigating, you find that these 10 generations are just not enough to cover the necessary time span. So let's spend some time appreciating the fact that this genealogy in Ruth does not seem to be sufficient. And this discussion of Ruth is going to tie back into what Matthew is doing in his genealogy. So let's just spend some time dealing with Ruth. And to do so, we first need to create a chronology. Now, if you've dealt with Old Testament chronology, there is one verse that you're going to come up against again and again, and that's 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, in which we read, "In the 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Zivs," which is the second month, "he began to build the house of the Lord." So let's create a time span here, and let's right here put the construction of the temple. And notice that in this 1 Kings quote, it tells us there's 480 years from Israel coming out of Egypt to the 4th year of Solomon's reign till the building of the temple. So 480 years from the building of the temple to the Exodus. So this is 480 years. But can we be more specific? And we can. And I'm going to be quoting from this article here by Vizron. It's peer-reviewed, so I'm not quite sure if I can share it with you, but I'll try to. And in this article, Ron notes, "Since the Israelites wandered for 40 years before entering the land of Israel, we are left with 440 years from entering Israel until the temple." So let's stop there. So Ron is telling us that Israel wandered for 40 years before entering Canaan. So therefore, we can put the entering of Canaan as 40 years after the Exodus. So this allows us to be a bit more specific. Ron continues, if we then subtract 70 years of King David's life and 4 years of King Solomon's reign before the temple was built, we are left with 366 years. Let's stop there. What Ron is telling us is that this first King's quote tells us that Solomon began building the temple in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So in the 4th year of his reign, he began to build the temple. So if we go 4 years back from the construction of the temple, we arrive at the coronation of Solomon. If we then appreciate the fact that Solomon became king when his father died, and David died at the age of 70, we can get to David's birth by going back 70 years. So David was born 70 years before Solomon took the throne. Ron notes, we are then left with 366 years from entering Israel to the birth of David. This period of 366 years is covered by only 4 of ancestors of David: Salma, Boaz, Obed, and Jesse. So there's 366 years from entering Israel to David. Now if we now take Ruth's genealogy, well, we have Salmon, we have Boaz, we have Obed, we have Jesse, then we have David. So Ron here notes that we have 4 ancestors covering a period of 366 years. Salmon, Boaz, Obed, and Jesse cover 366 years. This presents us with a real difficult issue. The reason being is that if we take 366 years and divide it by 4, and by doing this we're going to get the average childbearing age of these men, we're going to arrive at 91 years of age, which is an extremely old age to be having kids, even in biblical times. So let's refer to, and this is a point that Ron himself makes. He notes, based on this calculation, even if Salma was an infant when he entered Israel, each one of these Davidic ancestors would have had to father the next in line at a very advanced age, an age of 91, in order to encompass more than 3.5 centuries. So Ruth's genealogy presents us with a really difficult problem, because 91 is the most conservative estimate we can give, because in 91 years of age, we are assuming that Salmon was a baby when he entered Israel. But Ruth's genealogy becomes a bit more difficult when we consider how Matthew deals with it, because Matthew is going to tell us something a bit different, is going to add to Ruth's genealogy, and he's going to add to it by telling us that Salmon actually married Rahab. Now, you should remember Rahab from Joshua chapter 2. She's the prostitute that hid the Israelites. And the reason why this presents us a problem is because if Salmon married Rahab, Salmon could not have been a baby when he entered Israel, which therefore is going to push this age up even higher. Hagner, in his commentary, writes something very interesting about Rahab. He notes, the reference to Rahab has been added to the genealogical list, apparently by Matthew himself. No Rahab is mentioned in the Old Testament lists, which probably serve as a source, cross-reference 1 Chronicles 2, Ruth 4. If the Rahab of the conquest narrative is in view, as most commentators agree, then Rahab appears several generations, or something like 2 centuries too late. In Jewish literature, Rahab is said to have married Joshua. So here Hagner is noting a real issue with Matthew's genealogy. Only in Matthew's genealogy are we told that Rahab married Solomon. Nowhere else in the Old Testament are we told this. And Matthew, by adding Rahab, presents us with an issue because Rahab appears several generations, or something like 2 centuries too late. And that's why, according to rabbinical scholars, Rahab married Joshua rather than Solomon, because Joshua was, there at the time. And other commentators have noted this issue. For instance, in the Bible Knowledge Commentary, we read, according to Matthew 1:5, Boaz's mother was Rahab, the Canaanite harlot from Jericho. However, Rahab lived in Joshua's time, about 250 years earlier. Probably then Rahab was Boaz's mother, in the sense that she was his ancestress. Cross-reference our father Abraham, Romans 4:12, which means our ancestor Abraham. So this commentary is noting the issue Matthew's genealogy has by telling us that Salmon married Rahab, And the way it circumvents this issue is by simply telling us that Salmon is not actually the father of Boaz, but rather just his ancestor, meaning that there are other generations between Salmon and Boaz. Refer to my previous videos where I discuss how this is not a legitimate conclusion and not a legitimate solution, because Matthew cannot skip generations because he specifically tells us that there are 14 generations. I'm not going to rehearse that all here, but go back to my previous videos, especially the video about the 3 missing generations between Joram and Uzziah. But I just want to show you that there is a difficulty that Matthew's genealogy presents us by putting Rahab here. But I also want to get back to the difficulty that just the sheer fact of Ruth's genealogy has. Ruth's genealogy gives us real strife by adding more names. Matthew makes it a little bit worse by adding in Rahab. But let me end by just putting a real point on this and really showing you that 91 years of age is just the conservative estimate. If Salmon was 20 years of age when he entered Israel, this becomes much worse. And this point is made in a book entitled The Chronology of the Old Testament, which reads, with only 4 lifespans to fill this time gap, and taking Salmon's age to be about 20 at the entry would require Salmon to have fathered Boaz around 100 years of age. Boaz would also have had to father Obed at nearly 100, who in turn would have had to have begat Jesse at around 100. Jesse then would have begotten David at the age of 86 and been about 100 when David was anointed by Samuel. So here he notes that 91 is only if we take Salmon to be a baby when he entered Israel. It is more likely that he was 20 years of age, and in which case we're left with the years of 100, 100, 186 for these men giving birth to their children, which presents us with a real problem. Now you might be typing away in the comments, but people in the Bible live very long, so this really isn't an issue. But the issue is when we compare these people to their contemporaries, and this is what the commentary here will continue to note. He notes, comparative ages of the oldest biblical contemporaries over these intervals are Moses 120, Aaron 123, Ehud 110, Eli 98, and David old at age 70. As these decreasing ages depict, during this era, lifespans continued to shorten after the time of the global deluge and finally reached modern life expectancies. Thus, even this scenario requires a series of miracle births, whereby men begot sons at nearly 100 across a span of time when most men were scarcely living that long. So this issue presents us with a real issue because people simply weren't living this long and this period of time. So Ruth's genealogy presents us with a real issue. Matthew compounds that issue, but I really want to just discuss Ruth for the time being. Ruth presents us a real issue in presenting so few generations from entering Israel to Canaan. 4 generations simply isn't enough generations to explain this. In the next video, we'll be discussing why Ruth has done this. And is there any theological motives why Ruth would want to give us so few generations? So that's what we'll be dealing with in the next video. I hope you join me.